Contrary to popular belief, African American history did not start with slavery in the New World. An overwhelming body of new evidence is emerging, which proves that Africans had frequently sailed across the Atlantic to the Americas thousands of years before Columbus, and indeed before the Vikings. The great African civilization of Egypt, together with many North and West African people, traveled to the Americas and even contributed immensely to the early American culture by their architecture, art, political systems, and religious practices, as well as mathematics, writing, and a sophisticated calendar. The most substantial evidence of African presence in America comes from the pen of Christopher Columbus himself. Columbus noted in his journal that Native Americans had confirmed that black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears. Columbus also saw the metal goods from West Africa, and he even obtained them from the Native Americans. Chemical analyses of gold tips found by Columbus on spears in the Americas showed that the gold most certainly came from West Africa. In 1992, a German researcher who was performing tests on mummies found traces of hashish, tobacco, and cocaine in the hair, skin, and bones of the ancient Egyptian mummies. Tobacco and coca were plants that only grew in the Americas at the time of mummification. So just how did these exotic opiates arrive in ancient Egypt before the discovery of the New World? This crucial piece of evidence proves that ancient civilizations were not only interconnected in the distant past, but also elaborate trade routes were established thousands of years ago. Perhaps the most famous discovery of all is the ancient Egyptian colony found in the Grand Canyon. This extraordinary discovery made the front page of the Arizona Gazette in 1909. Two archaeologists encountered a series of bizarre caves in the Marble Canyon region of the Grand Canyon. The caves were full of Egyptian artifacts, including statues, copper weapons, and even granaries full of seeds. The cave system was so big it resembled a subterranean city, which was big enough to accommodate 50,000 people. Many mummified bodies of Egyptian origin were also found. The two archaeologists who made the discovery made the mistake of involving the Smithsonian. As we mentioned in our video about the discoveries of giant skeletons and how they were all covered up by the Smithsonian, the case with the Egyptian colony in the Grand Canyon was no different. Allegedly, the Smithsonian took full control of the excavation and took possession of all of the artifacts and mummies. Later, when questions about this discovery were forwarded to the Smithsonian, they simply denied that any of this had ever happened. They said they had no records of the archaeologists who found the colony, nor of the discovery itself. The story was left forgotten, and the historical status quo that ancient civilizations weren't advanced enough to travel to the Americas still remains. If ancient Egyptians could organize large-scale transoceanic voyages, wouldn't we find more evidence of their travels? Well, we have. It's just that mainstream scholars firmly oppose the discoveries while tagging them as elaborate hoaxes. An example of this is the intriguing set of Egyptian hieroglyphs located in Australia. Referred to as the Gosford glyphs, the intricate set of symbols is believed to have been carved some 5,000 years ago by ancient Egyptians who visited Australia. They were written in the archaic style of the early dynasties, a style that has been studied very little and is untranslatable by most Egyptologists. However, Egyptologist Mohammed Ibrahim and Kemet School co-director Youssef Abdel Hakim Aouyan, who have studied ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs their entire lives, were able to decipher the enigma. They worked with a group of people to translate the mysterious engravings, and the result was incredible. Not only are the mysterious ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in Australia authentic, but the scribes accurately used several ancient symbols and grammatical variations which, crucially, were not even documented in Egyptian hieroglyphic texts until 2012, proving the glyphs are not a hoax, as people in the 1900s couldn't have possibly used this style of writing. Ancient civilizations are far more advanced than we think. The people of ancient India, for example, knew of modern-day England and called it the Island of the White Cliffs. Their Vishnu Purana describes, to the amazement of many, parts of Europe, the Americas, and even the North Polar zones of our planet. The famous Piri Reis map, which was created by an Ottoman admiral in 1513 using lost ancient knowledge from the Royal Library, depicts with extreme precision North and South America, and most shockingly, it depicts the land of Antarctica before it was covered with ice. Piri Reis further stated that he had used 10 ancient Arab sources and 4 Indian maps to create it. The Olmec civilization was the first significant civilization in Mesoamerica and deemed mother culture of Mexico by some historians. This civilization was apparently dominated by Africans, as it's best known for the colossal carved African heads in central Mexico that serve as even more evidence that Africans sailed to the New World in ancient times. The heads are clearly crafted in the likeness of Africans, as their noses and mouths don't match any other race. The same civilization that created these giant heads was also responsible for introducing the written language, arts, sophisticated astronomy, and mathematics to the Mesoamerican civilization. There have been many instances of archaeologists discovering skulls and skeletons that clearly belong to people of African descent. Polish professor Andrzej Wierzyński revealed the discovery of African skulls at Olmec sites in Tilitilco, Cerro de las Mesas, and Monte Alban. Even more ancient African skeletons that would predate Columbus' arrival in the Americas were discovered throughout Central America and South America, with some even being unearthed in what is now California. Christopher Columbus wasn't the only European explorer who made a note of an African presence in the Americas upon his arrival. Historians reveal that at least a dozen other explorers, including Vasco Núñez de Balboa, also made a record of seeing black people when they reached the New World. The accounts match up with the reports from the natives in Mexico. Nicolas Leon, an eminent Mexican authority, recorded the oral traditions of his people and ultimately kept track of a critical piece of evidence that black people made it to the New World far before their European counterparts. His reports revealed accounts from natives saying that the oldest inhabitants of Mexico were blacks. Nearly all the American races commonly believe that black people visited their continent, and they have many words to designate them. Some people insist that Africans couldn't have made it to the New World first, merely because they didn't have the skill and resources to sail across the Atlantic. As it turns out, that's completely false. Historians have discovered evidence that suggests Africans were masters at building ships, and that it was actually a part of their tradition. As little as 6,000 years ago, the vast Sahara Desert was covered in grassland that received plenty of rainfall. There was a massive lake called Mega Chad, which was the largest body of fresh water on the planet, with an area of 400,000 square kilometers, bigger than the Caspian Sea. African ships often crossed these large lakes to get from place to place and traded with other African civilizations along the way. The Sahara shipbuilding and sailing are over 10,000 years old, and cave wall paintings of ancient ships were displayed in National Geographic magazine years ago. Ancient kingdoms in West Africa have a long history of trade by sail, which made it all the more likely that they eventually expanded their trade to the Americas. With those shipbuilding skills and the navigation skills that were noted by other historians of the time, the myth that Africans wouldn't have been able to sail to the New World becomes officially debunked. As Dr. Julian Whitewright, a maritime archaeologist at the University of Southampton, explained, the voyage from Africa on ancient ships was quite a plausible undertaking, based on the capabilities of the vessel of the period and historical material stating it took place. After expanding their trade to the Americas, the Africans certainly made their mark, as things like African native cotton were soon being discovered all across North America. As you can see, numerous pieces of evidence supporting the idea that ancient African civilizations had the ability of transoceanic voyages in the distant past, leaving behind clues that researchers today are finally picking up. Located in the Museum of the Seminary of Sherbrooke in Quebec, Canada, there are a set of mysterious stones with Libyan inscriptions on them. According to many who have researched them, these stones offer conclusive evidence that neither the Vikings nor Columbus traveled to America first, but a culture from northern Africa 2,500 years ago. And at the time of the discovery, the considerably weathered stones were covered with 2 lines of an unknown script. Professor Thomas Lee, a Laval University archaeologist, deciphered the inscriptions and confirmed they were written in a Libyan script. He said, "The Libyans would have been operating, in my opinion, out of Carthage, which was a Phoenician city at the time." He added that the inscriptions suggest an ancient expedition from Africa reached the area after sailing up the St. Francis River. The inscriptions are written in a format called boustropheden, in which you read the first line left to right and the next line right to left. Professor Howard Fell of the Department of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University also believed that the message was in Libyan from North Africa and translated as following: "Thus far our expedition traveled in the service of Lord Hiram to conquer land. This is the record of Hatta, who attained this great river, moored this ship, and cut these words in stone." Dr. Fell is best known for his work in New World epigraphy, and he believes that various inscriptions in the Americas can only be explained by extensive pre-Columbian contact with Old World African civilizations. Professor Fell's work was, unsurprisingly, rejected by most mainstream scholars who firmly reject the notion that African explorers arrived in the American continents around 2,500 years ago. Professor Fell also said that the reference found in ancient African inscriptions, "barbarous lands at the end of the world," definitely described the Americas. The Davenport stele was unearthed in a burial mound in 1877 in Iowa. It contains a carving of the so-called opening of the mouth ceremony, which is of Nubian and Egyptian origin. Dr. Barry Fell, a Harvard scholar with an avocation for ancient writings, said that Egyptian and Libyan explorers had sailed up the Mississippi River and left this written stone tablet. According to Professor Fell, the Davenport stele contains a trilingual text in the Egyptian, Iberian Punic, and Libyan languages. Of course, mainstream archaeologists condemned it as a forgery and denied that Africans discovered America. In his book, America B.C., Ancient Settlers in the New World, Professor Fell surmised that the Davenport stele dates back to the 22nd or Libyan dynasty of the Egyptian Empire, a period of overseas exploration. On one side of the artifact, there are carvings of Egyptian writing and the depiction of an ancient Egyptian festival. On the other side, there is a picture of 2 Egyptian obelisks, a pyramid, and African animals. In the book, "The First Americans Were Africans: Documented Evidence," Dr. David Imhotep writes about the depicted festival. He said, "The religious similarities here are numerous and sometimes not only similar but identical to the Djed festival of ancient Egypt. This ceremony traces back, however, before Egypt to Nubia, because the Egyptian god Osiris is part of the ceremony. This means the Djed festival predates even Egypt." The other stele we mentioned is the Pontotoc stele, which depicts the life-giving rays of the sun descending upon the earth beneath. This symbol is very similar to the Aten symbol of the Egyptians. The stele also had Ogham Punic inscriptions, sufficiently clear to disclose the phrases, "When Baal Ra rises in the east, the beasts are content, and when he hides his face, they are displeased." If we can imagine that Vikings visited America in medieval times, why shouldn't Phoenicians, Libyans, Egyptians, or other ancient sailing cultures do the same? We're going to tell you the story of Mansa Abu Bakr II of the Mali Empire, who gave up his throne to explore the Atlantic Ocean and eventually reach the shores of America. Mansa Abu Bakr II was a 14th century ruler of the Mali Empire in West Africa. The 14th century was a time when the Mali Empire had reached its pinnacle. In this period, the Mali Empire was even bigger than the Holy Roman Empire. The empire's peace and stability may have allowed a rather bizarre episode in Abu Bakr's reign to take place. According to Syrian historian al-Umari, who met Musa in Cairo, the Malian ruler's predecessor had abdicated his throne so that he could explore the Atlantic Ocean. Very little is known about the life of Abu Bakr, and the only known written account about him at present can be found in the work of al-Umari, who recorded the ascension of the throne of Abu Bakr's heir. One English translation of al-Umari's talk with Abu Bakr's heir and how he ascended to the throne is as follows. So Abu Bakr equipped 200 ships filled with men and the same number equipped with gold, water, and provisions, enough to last them for years. He left me to deputies for him and embarked on the Atlantic Ocean with his men. That was the last we saw of him and all those who were with him. And so I became king in my own right. Later, al-Umari writes that a few ships of Abu Bakr returned and tell stories of the mysterious land, and how the ships found a river and entered into the unknown. Whilst the aim of this story was to explain the way in which the heir of Abu Bakr gained the throne of the Mali Empire, heralding the beginning of a new lineage of rulers, there seems to be much more focus in modern times on the actions of Abu Bakr and his discovery of the Americas. Evidence that seemed to support such claims have even been presented. Place names on old maps, for example, are said to show that Abu Bakr and his men had landed in the New World. The Malians are claimed to have named certain places after themselves, such as Mandinga Port, Mandinga Bay, and Sierre de Mali. The exact locations of such sites, however, are unclear, as one source states that these places are in Haiti, while another puts them in the region of Mexico. As time allows us to drift further and further away from the European age of exploration, and we move beyond an age of racial, intellectual prejudice, historians are beginning to recognize that Africans were skilled navigators long before Europeans, contrary to popular belief. Of course, some Western historians continue to refute this fact because, consciously or unconsciously, they are still hanging on to the 19th century notion that seafaring was a European monopoly. After all, history will tell you that seafaring is the quintessential European achievement, the single endeavor of which Europeans are awfully proud. Seafaring allowed Europe to conquer the world. The notion that black Africans braved the roaring waters of the Atlantic Ocean and beat Europeans to the New World threatens a historically white sense of ownership over the seas. During the 19th and 20th centuries, several scholars wrote books and articles about this subject and urged the academic establishment to change primary and secondary curricula across the United States to reflect the great contributions of African people to early America. Unfortunately, such pleas fell on deaf ears, and today the children are still being taught in school the tale that Columbus discovered America.